Hey guys, today we visit a cold, damp corner of medieval Europe, where candlelight flickers against mossy stone and the scent of wet wool clings to the air like an overbearing sermon. Your feet crunch over gravel as you approach a lonely hilltop monastery, one of those places that always seems to smell faintly of boiled cabbage and repentance. The bells aren't ringing for prayer today. No, something altogether more curious is afoot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm always amazed where you all tune in from. Now, relax, maybe put on some soft music, and let's get started on today's journey together. You're here to meet Brother Edgard. He's not the abbot or the cook or even particularly good at copying manuscripts. But he is the monastery's most persistent thinker. The kind of monk who squints at birds for hours and mutters things like "that pigeon might hold answers." He's the kind of man who, when tasked with cleaning the chapel floor, ends up mapping the dust to look for divine patterns. And yes, he's currently attempting to weigh a human soul. You find him hunched over in a cold corner of the scriptorium, surrounded by cracked parchment, lead weights, and what might be the monastery's last surviving kitchen scale. It squeaks when he nudges it, as if offended by its misuse. If a soul has weight, he tells you solemnly, we simply must find the moment it leaves. Of course, the other monks have opinions. Mostly, that Edgard needs more sleep. Or possibly less of the fermented carrot wine Brother Lucien's been hiding in the apothecary jars. But Edgard isn't deterred. He's read the scriptures, the pagan scrolls, even one particularly grim Icelandic saga that mentions souls as mist rising from the chest. It gave him the idea to catch one. Perhaps with gauze. Or beeswax. Or both. He's fashioned a makeshift platform out of a butchered table, an old cloak, and a borrowed, without asking, brass weight set. It wobbles. Spectacularly. But he insists it's sensitive enough to measure a soul's departure. He just needs, well, the right subject. Which leads us to Brother Thomas. A kindly monk with a wheeze like an old bellows and a fondness for root stew. Thomas, sadly, is not long for this world. And he's agreed somewhat enthusiastically, in fact, to allow Edgard to try his soul-weighing experiment when the time comes. Better than just lying there, he says, might as well be useful. You try to imagine explaining this to literally anyone else in the world and decide not to try. The monastery, for its part, carries on. Morning prayers, afternoon chores, and evening gruel. But Edgard tinkers obsessively, testing the balance by breathing on it, poking it with sticks, and once, memorably, placing a goose on one side and 3 potatoes on the other to see if they equal out. They do not. He's also written letters. Mostly to himself, but occasionally to bishops and theologians. The responses range from polite confusion to outright suspicion. Brother Edgard, one bishop writes, should perhaps spend less time with weights and more time with the weight of sin. Touché. Still, there's one documented historical reference that gives him hope. A 10th century Persian text he's found in the abbey's forbidden cabinet stored behind the dried fish describes the soul as a subtle breath made heavy by memory. That line lives rent-free in his head. And so, like a medieval Steve Jobs, Edgard persists with his passion project, pacing the cloisters at night with ink-stained fingers and muttering equations that don't quite add up. If the soul is lighter than air, he reasons aloud, then what of helium? You gently remind him helium hasn't been discovered yet. He nods, solemnly. Soon, then. Every monk has their quirks. Brother Renard talks to herbs. Brother Hugo eats his own ink. But Edgard is beginning to worry people. Not because he's doing anything wrong, but because he's doing something different. And in the 14th century, that's often worse. There's an open scholarly debate about whether souls have physical mass. Some say yes, based on a series of later, very questionable 20th century experiments. Others believe the soul is metaphysical, beyond weight or scale. Edgard lands squarely in the try it and see camp, armed with hope and 3 increasingly anxious pigeons. His latest theory? That the soul leaves the body in the final breath and momentarily hovers a measurable pause before it disperses. He's even borrowed Brother Anselm's hourglass, to keep time by the grains of mortality, he says. You think he just likes how it sounds. Still, amid all the oddness, there's something sweet about Edgard's quest. He truly wants to understand what happens at the edge of life. Not for glory or theological fame, he has no idea how fame works, but because he's genuinely curious. Like a child asking where the moon goes in the day. And so he watches. He writes. He rebalances his wobbling scales and talks gently to Brother Thomas, who, for the record, thinks this whole thing is absolutely hilarious. Tell Saint Peter I was a pioneer, Thomas whispers with a grin. Edgard nods. You shall be my data point. Outside, the seasons shift. Frost creeps over the garden. The monastery goats grow thicker coats. And Edgard readies himself for the experiment that might just prove or fail to prove one of history's most elusive mysteries. The night comes quietly, as all good nights do in monasteries tucked between pine-thick hills and the rustle of ghost stories. Candles hiss against the drafty stone. Somewhere down the hall, a rat boldly drags half a crust past the dormitory door. You are awake, barely, curled on a bench with a cloak you're pretending is a blanket, waiting for Brother Edgard's big moment. Brother Thomas is slipping. His breath, once wheezy and full of complaint, now whistles in gentle irregular stutters. The other monks have said their prayers and made their peace. A few muttered something about heresy before retiring. Early monks are not exactly known for their open-minded sleep schedules. Edgard, meanwhile, is vibrating with anticipation. You can't tell if it's nerves, lack of sleep, or just the sheer number of stale apple cores he's been chewing on to stay alert. Tonight, he says, eyes wild and shining, we find what leaves, and if anything stays behind. He's arranged Thomas's cot onto the scale platform, not a sentence you ever expected to think, let alone witness. It creaks under the weight, but holds. Edgard's counterweights are precisely measured with every object he could find, a wedge of cheese, some dried lentils, and a beautifully smooth rock he swears contains saintly energy. You're skeptical. The rock smells like soup. The rules of science, insofar as medieval monks even believe in the idea of rules outside divine decree, are thrown to the wind. But Edgard tries. He notes the baseline weight, scratches it onto parchment with hands trembling from cold or caffeine or dread. The room is still. Not wholly still, just the kind of stillness that comes before something stupid or brilliant happens. Brother Thomas gives one last smile. If you drop me, I'm haunting you, he wheezes. Edgard bows deeply. You shall haunt me with glory. Then it happens. A soft gasp. A single exhale that curls upward, warmer than the air around it. And then nothing. The scale doesn't move. Edgard waits. Stares. Waits longer. You shift in your seat and accidentally knock over the hourglass. Oops. He blinks. Scribbles something down. Runs a hand through hair that probably hasn't been properly washed since the last papal election. Did it move? He whispers. It did not. but then, 2 minutes later, the scale creaks. Ever so slightly. A fractional dip. You're not sure if it's the platform settling, or the wind, or your own hopeful imagination. Edgard, however, gasps like he's just seen the Virgin Mary juggle eggs. "There," he shouts, pointing. "Proof. You look. It could be anything." The scale is twitchy. The room has draft lines from 3 different centuries. And the cheese wedge has developed a suspiciously melty corner. But Edgard doesn't care. He's already halfway through declaring that the soul must wait a moment before departure. A pause, he murmurs, like a sigh before a journey. "You suggest that it might have been the cot shifting." He nods thoughtfully. Then absolutely ignores you. The next day, he's insufferable. He paces with his nose in the air, muttering phrases like revolutionary metaphysics and quantified mortality as if anyone around him has a clue what he means. Brother Hugo tries to trip him in the courtyard. He misses. At breakfast, Edgard makes a formal announcement that the soul weighs less than 1 dram but definitely more than nothing. Brother Lucien spits his porridge. Someone claps sarcastically. But behind the sarcasm, something has shifted. A few of the monks begin to ask questions, not theological ones, no, but curious ones. What does a soul look like? Could it be trapped? Is it tied to breath, or heartbeat, or the last flicker of thought? Edgard, high on both speculation and stolen ginger root, begins building his next prototype. A 2-scale system, one for the body, one for the space above it. To catch the soul in its upward flight, he explains. Like weighing an angel's leap. You have serious doubts. Chief among them, what if the soul doesn't go up? Still, he tries. His workshop now includes wax paper traps, bundles of herbs he thinks might attract lingering spirits, and a new set of weights carved from blessed beeswax. Which, incidentally, makes the entire area smell like church mixed with old honey. You ask him what he'll do if he proves the soul weighs nothing. He frowns. Then I shall prove its motion instead. You blink. And if it doesn't move? He gasps, like you've told him the sky's a lie. Everything moves, he says. Even God. To be fair, medieval theologians did argue quite obsessively over the movement of the soul. Some said it rises, others claimed it disperses like vapor, and a few suggested it remains stuck to the body for a while, especially if the person had unresolved guilt or debts. Apparently, souls are not above holding grudges. As days pass, Edgard's lab becomes the strangest corner of the monastery. Monks drop by, pretending to borrow ink, but secretly hoping to witness a floating soul or at least a good explosion. One night, you catch Brother Renard sneaking in with a cat, whispering, just to see if it works. Edgard starts recording everything. He sketches breath clouds in winter air, logs the scent of final exhalations, and even claims to have heard a sound just once like a harp string being plucked at the moment of death. You suspect it was the mousetrap snapping. There's one fringe belief, floated by a wandering Franciscan scholar, that the soul travels first through the feet, explaining why the dying often feel cold toes. Edgard tests this by placing a scale under only the feet. It tips dramatically after someone drops a candle nearby. Progress, he shouts. You sigh. Through all this, no actual soul has been captured, bottled, or definitively weighed. But Edgard's face is alive with purpose. In a world of leeches and relics, he's found something stranger to believe in, something unquantifiable, but worth chasing. And for now, that's enough. By now, The abbey is buzzing with gossip, incense, and the distant sound of Edgard's latest contraption breaking. It's his third attempt this week. You arrive just in time to witness him staring at a warped copper scale that's clearly been cursed by either gravity or his complete disregard for balance mechanics. You ask if it's going well. He shrugs. It's going somewhere. A small plume of smoke rises from the candle he's placed under a glass bell jar filled with basil leaves. Apparently, he's trying to tempt the soul with pleasant aromas. You do not tell him that last week's soup smelled the same and repelled 3 people into the garden for an hour. What's interesting is that despite the mockery and cracked apparatuses, something in the monastery is shifting. Monks who used to roll their eyes now lean in during supper, asking what the soul might feel when it leaves. Is it warm? Does it know it's gone? One even wonders aloud whether you could catch it in a mirror. You glance nervously at the tarnished one near the refectory. Just in case. Edgard's obsession grows. He begins reciting scripture with unusual selectivity, mostly passages that imply motion, lightness, or the breath of life. Genesis, Ecclesiastes, Job, anything vaguely floaty. His favorite line becomes "The Spirit returns unto God who gave it." He points upward every time he says it. Every time. Even during meals. You almost drop your spoon on the 4th dramatic gesture. But one evening, Edgard tries something bolder. He invites you to help him conduct an ethereal measurement. You're intrigued until he explains it involves weighing a body both before and after the last rites. The moment the soul hears the final amen, he explains, surely it begins to rise. You glance at the frail Brother Alaric, snoring softly by the hearth. That's Alaric, you say. Yes, Edgard replies. You raise an eyebrow. Edgard sighs. No, I'm not going to kill him. I just want to observe. You make him swear this plan does not involve poisoning, nudging, or theological guilt-tripping. Instead, the next week becomes an oddly reverent waiting game. Edgard prepares the chamber. He dusts the scale 3 times daily. He consults old texts, some with pages fused by damp fingers, others with notes in margins from scribes who clearly believed in dragons. He even reblesses the floor tiles with holy water, just in case the soul travels low. There's one particularly ridiculous moment where he hangs a cloth banner reading "Welcome, departing essence." You remove it after the abbot threatens to assign him to latrine duty for spiritual insubordination. Then one cold morning, the bell tolls. Not for breakfast. Brother Alaric is slipping away, and the abbey knows it. You and Edgard move quickly. The chamber is prepared. The cot rests on a meticulously balanced wooden frame. Edgard triple checks the measurements. He even puts a feather on top of the glass bell jar, hoping it will flutter if anything passes upward. Brother Alaric is barely conscious, but smiling. He'd volunteered, in his own way. Something about the beauty of being part of a mystery, even in his final breath. He grasps Edgard's hand and says, "If you don't find a soul, maybe you'll find wonder instead." It's probably the most poetic thing anyone said all month, and it makes Edgard sniffle, which you pretend not to notice. The prayers begin. Candles flicker. The cold stone around you hums faintly as though remembering all the monks who've whispered their goodbyes here before. Edgard holds his breath. You watch. And then Alaric exhales. The candle dimly gutters. The feather does not move. The scale dips slightly. Just once. Then settles. No dramatic levitation. No floating orb. No choir of angels. But Edgard swears he felt something. A pressure change. A hush. You felt it too, maybe. Or maybe it's the power of suggestion, the weight of centuries of stories telling you that something should happen when a soul leaves. Later, in the quiet of the hallway, Edgard is a mix of ecstatic and heartbroken. "I think it passed," he whispers. "I think it didn't care if we noticed." He records everything. The time of death. The exact position of the candle. The way the air smelled faintly of lilies. There were no lilies. He starts to wonder if the soul isn't a thing you measure in weight at all but in absence. That maybe the soul doesn't go anywhere. Maybe it simply is, and then it isn't, and the world tilts ever so slightly in its wake. This is where things get controversial. Edgard starts talking about non-mass transitions and invisible divine signatures. The other monks call it blasphemy or, worse, philosophy. Brother Hugo tries to stage an intervention involving soup and forced sleep. It doesn't work. But Edgard's not alone in his theorizing. In secret, a few curious minds begin sneaking into the library late at night. They flip through forgotten books on Pythagorean numbers and Jewish mysticism. They ask dangerous questions: could the soul be light itself? Or heat? Or memory? One fringe idea emerges: what if the soul chooses to go only when unobserved? That perhaps it recoils from measurement, from being pinned like a butterfly to parchment. Like a shy guest at a party, it slips out unnoticed the moment the room turns away. Edgard latches onto this. He builds a contraption with mirrors angled away from the body. A soul privacy shield, he calls it. You suggest naming it something less creepy. He does not listen. He also experiments with silence. Complete silence. No monks. No chanting. No breath. Just stillness. He wants to see if, without witnesses, the soul makes more of a fuss. He gets no answer. And yet, the monastery is forever changed. Death is no longer just a ritual, it's an event. A mystery. Something not to fear, but to wonder at. Even Brother Hugo, former skeptic and porridge slinger, begins to hum hymns with softer tones when someone passes. No one can prove Edgard right. But no one can prove him wrong, either. Which, in medieval terms, is basically the same as being declared a prophet. Days pass. Then weeks. The soul scale collects dust in the far corner of the chamber, beside a basket of unused sandals and an aggressive-looking crucifix carved by a monk who apparently had some unresolved anger issues. Edgard, however, refuses to give up. You find him pacing the cloister garden at odd hours, muttering about thermal displacement, auric vibrations, and the spiritual density of intent, which you're pretty sure he made up on the spot. He starts scribbling diagrams in chalk on flagstones, which the rain washes away faster than he can finish. He tries again. This time, Edgard believes it isn't about weight at all, but about sound. Every soul, he explains while stuffing dried rosemary into a clay pot, must sing its own exit note. You raise an eyebrow. He nods earnestly. A pitch too faint for mortal ears. So now, the abbey's chapel sometimes echoes with bizarre whistling tests and unexplainable flute solos. One monk accuses him of courting demons. Another mistakes the noise for a sick goat and calls for a shepherd. But despite the nonsense, there's a growing undercurrent of curiosity. Even the abbot starts asking more gently. He wants to know, not whether Edgard's methods are holy, but whether they are, at least, harmless. That's progress. One night, as you both sit beneath the moonlight, Edgard brings up a scroll he's found buried in the oldest chest behind the scriptorium. It's a scrap of Greek, translated through Latin, then miscopied into Old French, and finally annotated in a hand that looked like it had been guided by a chicken. Still, he believes it hints at a legend from Alexandria. A monk unnamed who once built a scale not for the body, but for the moment. A device that could capture the instant of soul departure by detecting the bending of divine time. What does that even mean, you ask? Edgard shrugs. Probably nothing. But I think I'm getting close. And for the first time, you wonder if he might be right. There's a shift in how people see him now. Not quite a prophet, not quite a fool. More like a monk standing at the edge of a dark forest, cupping his hands around his mouth, calling out to something that might never answer. And yet still calling. But here's where the legend turns inward. Because one day, Edgard gets sick. At first, it's just a cough. Then a fever. Nothing alarming. He claims it's from sleeping in the cellar to catch ambient soul frequencies. You suggest a blanket. He refuses. By week's end, he's too weak to lift his own ink pot. You sit with him. He's pale, but burning from the inside. His fingers still twitch, reaching for parchment he can't hold. I wanted one more test, he says, blinking slowly. A perfect moment. A clear death. Measured. Proved. You tell him to rest. You say there's no point in pushing now. He smiles faintly. But it was the point, wasn't it? That night, you sneak into the chapel and polish the scale. Just in case. It's different when it's him. He's not some elderly volunteer or curious bystander. He's the center of it. The madman with the mirror angles and the soul privacy shield and the jar of holy cinnamon sticks. Don't ask. You place a candle by the window. The moonlight shifts. And sometime between matins and lauds, he breathes his last. No fanfare. No bells. Just silence, and a faint warmth on the stone where he lay. You wait. The scale doesn't move. The candle doesn't flicker. The air, though, feels heavier. Or lighter. Or just off, like a page turned before you finished the sentence. You spend the morning staring at that space where he had been, wondering if he'd gone somewhere, or if he'd just become somewhere else. In the days that follow, the abbey goes on. It always does. Prayers are sung. Meals are served. Porridge is still dreadful. But Edgard's work, his story starts to take root. Not because he proved anything, but because he tried. The soul scale stays in the chamber, next to a tiny inscription someone carves quietly. He waited for the silence. It came. Visitors begin to arrive, some curious, others grieving. They sit in the room and listen. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they laugh. A few leave letters, folded like tiny birds, placed on the scale in tribute. The monks argue, as monks do. Some say Edgard wasted time. Others think he glimpsed something sacred. But every one of them remembers him. And that's where the true debate lives on. Was he a scientist before his time? A holy fool? A man who believed too deeply in something you're not supposed to question? Or was he simply a monk who wanted to say goodbye to mystery, not with fear, but with reverence? Even now, there's no clear answer. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Because if the soul could be weighed, measured, captured in ink or stone, wouldn't it stop being a soul? And wouldn't that be the saddest thing of all? So you leave the chamber quietly one morning, the light just beginning to seep through the windows. You walk through the gardens he once chocked full of nonsense equations, hear the bells he used to chase birds away from, pass the tiny chapel where his whisper once lingered longer than his breath. And for the first time, you understand. He didn't want to trap the soul. He wanted to make it visible enough for wonder. The room stays quiet after that. You return from time to time, sitting on the worn bench near the wall, half expecting Edgard's voice to rise up from the floorboards. Not as a ghost, he'd hate that, but maybe as a stray thought, drifting between the rafters like incense. But of course, it's just you. Just silence. Just wood and stone and memories that won't line up neatly. Still, something's changed. You notice it in the way the younger monks glance at the chamber with a kind of soft awe. They whisper about it as if it holds some hidden passage, or an echo that only the brave can hear. A few claim to have felt something when sitting beside the scale. A warmth. A chill. One said he heard music, but it turned out to be Brother Halvard humming through his nose again. One day, a letter arrives from a monastery 2 valleys over. A curious note about a scholar who'd heard the tale and wants to replicate the experiment. He asks for specifications, blueprints, results. He includes the word peer review, which no one in the abbey understands but sounds impressive. You smile. Then shake your head. Edgard didn't leave behind a clean theory or a repeatable process. He left behind questions and a very wonky scale. But maybe that's more valuable. The soul, after all, isn't supposed to be a thing you trap. It's not a butterfly to be pinned behind glass or a math problem to be solved during lunch. It's closer to a story ever shifting, unreliable, full of contradictions that somehow feel truer than fact. That's what makes Edgard a legend, even if history barely remembers his name. He failed, yes. Repeatedly. Comically, at times. He once set the abbey tablecloth on fire while trying to test the weight of grief using candles and orange peels. He thought the soul might glow brighter when passing through linen. It didn't. But what lingers isn't the mistake, it's the reach. You picture him again, hunched over the parchment, tongue between his teeth, trying to sketch a diagram using ink made from blackberries and unholy levels of optimism. You remember the questions he asked. How do you know when a soul leaves? Where does it go? And can it take something with it? These weren't just philosophical ponderings. To Edgard, they were as practical as mending a robe or baking bread. The mystery of the soul was part of his daily routine. Like rain. Or sin. Or porridge. His peers once thought him delusional. Now, they think him brave. His old chamber slowly becomes a place of reflection. No loud pilgrimages, no dramatic claims. Just a steady trickle of wanderers who want to sit beside something that might have once tried to measure the immeasurable. There's a jar near the scale now. People leave written hopes in it. Prayers. Apologies. One note, folded into the shape of a fish, reads simply, "I miss her." Another just says, "Thank you for asking." You don't know who left them. But you suspect Edgard would have smiled. Maybe even cried. Probably tried to chart the emotional weight of gratitude using a teacup and a feather. And failed. Spectacularly. But that was always the point. Because beneath all the candles, chalk dust, failed tests, and soup-stained manuscripts, Edgard wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for connection. Between flesh and spirit. Between people and purpose. Between breath and the soft, almost inaudible moment when it stops. One evening, as twilight folds across the abbey's roof like a tired shawl, you sit outside his old door and think about your own soul. You wonder what it would measure, if it ever could. Heaviness. Joy. Regret. Music. You wonder if it's growing or shrinking or just staying still, waiting for a moment when it's needed. And then you realize maybe it's not about the weight. Maybe it's about the gesture. That someone, once upon a time, tried to cradle the invisible. Not for glory. Not for proof. But for love. Because to weigh a soul is to say, you matter. You are real, even in the silence. You, fleeting as you are, deserve to be held. Even just for a moment. Even by a man with crooked spectacles and a knack for spilling ink on everything he touched. And suddenly, in the dimming light, it doesn't matter that the scale never moved. Because you feel something shift inside you. Something feather soft. Something real. And now, as the final shadows settle and the story breathes its last, you let your mind drift gently away from dusty corridors and soul scales, from candlelit mutterings and the weight of unseen things. You imagine the stone floor of the abbey cooling beneath your feet, the worn bench beneath you warming with memory. The quiet hum of evening bells echoing somewhere far off, like a lullaby for the world itself. There's no need to chase meaning now. Let it come to you slowly, like mist curling over a field at dawn. Let it settle into your bones, soft and steady, without the pressure of understanding. Maybe you don't need to weigh a soul. Maybe it's enough to feel it. To honor its presence in a glance, a kindness, a question that doesn't need an answer. And maybe, somewhere out there, the spirit of a crooked old monk still chuckles softly when someone whispers into the quiet, hoping for a reply. So you breathe out now, just once, just slow, and let that breath carry the story into the dark. Not as fact. Not even as history. But as a kind of lullaby for the part of you that still wonders what might flicker in the space between a heartbeat and silence. Sleep well, dear listener. The questions are still waiting, but tonight, you don't need to answer them. You only need to rest. End story here. Sweet dreams.